So the three issues I care about the most are climate change, animal rights, and human rights. But these are difficult topics to bring up. For one, they're political, although not necessarily partisan. They're tied to people's identities, and they can be taboo. So I feel this tension. It's probably safer not to talk about them, but I feel like if I can just find the right messaging, then I should be able to talk about them in a way that doesn't get people upset. Look, I have my own strengths, my own blind spots, and my own internal struggles, so I am not one to judge. But these topics are still important to me, and I want to share my perspective. So in this video, I show how our emotions determine how we act towards these issues by discussing video clips and book passages that have impacted my thoughts over the years. So in this video, I hope to showcase the emotional reasons that people might not share my support for all three of these causes. And I hope to do this without threatening anyone's identity. This is a journey to live up to our own values. It's definitely not about shaming anyone. I hope you'll listen without judgment, and what you do with this knowledge is your choice. I'll first focus on climate change, then explore animal rights, and finally come back to human rights to show how these emotional patterns play out across all three. So the brain forms judgments almost instantaneously, and then it uses those judgments to provide a post hoc rationalization to support the judgments. It's not the other way around. It's not like you can say, the climate isn't warming because, and then fill in the blank with your favorite excuse. It's more like, I'm not an extremist climate alarmist, which is a perceived threat to your identity, and I would never support the Green New Deal. Therefore, the climate isn't warming. That's pretty weird, right? I mean, that's how our brains actually work. And you don't have to take my word for it either. Once you learn this is how your brain works, you can catch yourself doing this. So the next time you react to something, preferably in a non-political context, take a minute to ask yourself if the reason you gave immediately is actually the reason. And you'll see this to be true. I used to argue with people that didn't acknowledge climate change, and the arguments they gave would be more about protecting their identities than about why the Earth is or isn't warming. I've always thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could just skip over the rationalizations and get right to the root of the problem? What is it about climate change that people find threatening? Look, I understand the sentiment. These are normal emotions, and I can relate in other contexts. We just need to identify solutions that work for them and show them that they already care about the problem for their own reasons, which may or may not be the same reasons that liberal environmentalists care. So the moral psychologist and NYU professor, Jonathan Haidt, is the person that has had the largest influence on me politically. I read The Righteous Mind at the time when I was transitioning from being politically disengaged to politically active. This was right around the time I discovered that climate change was actually a political issue. And so this book formed the foundation of my political philosophy. The judgment first, rationalization second principle that I just mentioned, it has an entire section devoted to it in this book. Haidt presents an analogy for the emotional and rational parts of the brain as an emotional elephant and a rational rider. So the rider thinks it's calling the shots, but the elephant is just so much bigger and stronger than the rider, it has much more influence than the rider. Haidt shows that people are intuitionists, not rationalists. I mean, some people, of course, form identities as rationalists, and their intuition becomes aligned with being rational. But like all moral identities, it still has blind spots. So let me present the following passage that comes from the subsection in The Righteous Mind titled The Rationalist Delusion. See, rationalists often believe that the ability to reason will lead to better moral behavior, which isn't true. If you want to make people behave more ethically, there are two ways you can go. You can change the elephant, which takes a long time and is hard to do, or to borrow an idea from the book Switch by Chip Heath and Dan Heath, you can change the path that the elephant and rider find themselves traveling on. You can make minor and inexpensive tweaks to the environment. You can produce big increases in ethical behavior. You can hire Glaucon as a consultant and ask him how to design institutions in which real human beings, always concerned about their reputations, will behave more ethically. So what Haidt is really saying in this passage is that getting people to change who they are is really difficult. It can be done, but it takes a lot of motivation and dedication. The other option is just to change the environment that the people act in. They can continue to be themselves, and they can be more ethical if it aligns with what they're already doing. So let's take a look at climate change, for example. For climate action, this might be, what if we had a policy that makes the price of energy from fossil fuels relatively more expensive than the energy from renewable sources? In that case, even people that don't acknowledge climate change would still want to save money. So a lot of the refusal to acknowledge that climate change is happening, or that it's caused by man, or that it'll be harmful, or that there's anything we can do about it, or that we need to act with urgency, is a result of solution aversion. If one's perception of the solutions are threatening to their identity, then there's a good chance they will deny the problem in one way or another. So listen to what Haidt has to say about how Republicans like Glenn Beck would react to the Green New Deal.
I heard Glenn Beck say, the left will tell you that they're trying to save the planet and they're trying to save the oceans and the animals. But it's not about that. It's about control. They really just want to control the economy. They want to tell you what kind of car you can drive, what kind of light bulbs you can use. They want to shut down, et cetera, et cetera. So he goes on and on about how it's really just about controlling the economy. And I thought, all right, this is, I see why he's saying that, but this is kind of paranoid. I mean, climate crisis is real. I mean, the global warming was very visibly real by then. I thought this was kind of paranoid. Well, fast forward to the Green New Deal. What is the Green New Deal? It is exactly what Glenn Beck warned about. It is exactly what he diagnosed in 2007 as what the left was going to do. In other words, it's a giant bill that says we need all the things we've always said we need. High minimum wage, free healthcare, free everything. We need this, and that's the only way that we can solve the climate crisis. That the Green New Deal is perfectly crafted to turn off as many conservatives, Republicans, and libertarians as humanly possible. When the policy solution emphasized government regulation, such as a tax on carbon emissions, only 22% of Republicans said they believed the temperature projection was accurate. In other words, when you say the temperature is going to rise 3.2 degrees, and to fight it, we have to impose taxes and do things that you're not going to like. Republicans say, I don't even believe your projection. I don't think the Earth is warming that much, or I don't think it's warming at all. Conversely, when the proposed policy solution emphasized the free market, 55% of Republicans accepted the basic science. So we're not saying that if the solution is pleasant to Republicans, they will embrace the solution. That's not what this is about. It's a basic factual question. Is the Earth warming? And if your solution is threatening to them, then they say, no, the Earth is not warming. But if your solution is not threatening to them, then they're willing to say, yeah, the Earth is warming.
So unfortunately, the Green New Deal is not a bipartisan solution. It's unfortunate and avoidable that climate change has become so partisan. I personally like the Green New Deal. I wouldn't mind having it. But I think it would be more pragmatic if market-based solutions could just gain some more traction. So Ted Halstead from the conservative climate group, the Climate Leadership Council, he gave a really great TED Talk on an effective market-based solution. And these are the types of things that I'm really supportive of.
A conservative pathway forward. Yes, folks, a Republican climate solution is possible. And you know what? It may even be better. Application so transformative that it creates its own market. The psychological barrier, geopolitical barrier, the partisan barrier. Almost every leading editorial board in the country has since endorsed our plan. Gradually rising carbon tax to return all the money raised directly to citizens in the form of equal monthly dividends. Eliminating regulations that are no longer needed once that a carbon dividends plan is enacted. The new climate domino effect based on border carbon adjustments.
So even though market-based solutions are technically compatible with conservative ideology, some people have just formed really strong identities around not acknowledging that climate change is a problem. And these people will be unlikely to change. So we have to recognize this and not waste our time trying to convince certain people. Take a look at what Ezra Klein writes about Sean Hannity and why we're polarized. Imagine what would happen to, say, Sean Hannity if he decided tomorrow that climate change was the central threat facing the planet. Initially, his viewers would think he was joking, but soon they'd begin calling in furiously. Some would organize a boycott of his program. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of professional climate skeptics would begin angrily refuting Hannity's new crusade. Many of Hannity's friends in the conservative media would back away from him, and some would seek advantage by denouncing him. Politicians he respects would be furious at his betrayal of the cause. He would lose friendships, viewers, and money. He could ultimately lose his job, and along the way, he would cause himself immense personal pain as he systematically alienated his closest political and professional allies. The world would have to update its understanding of who Sean Hannity is and what he believes, and so too would Sean Hannity. Changing your identity is a psychologically and socially brutal process. So I guess you can't change everyone. But, I sure would sleep a lot better if we had an aggressive market-based mechanism in place to put a price on carbon. The really frustrating thing about this is that 67% of Americans surveyed by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication support requiring fossil fuel companies to pay a carbon tax. And then we could use that money to reduce other taxes, such as income tax, by an equal amount. Unfortunately, it's just not enough to support something rationally unless you're also emotionally supportive. Because without the emotions, we fail to act. Politicians don't have to support this if we don't pressure them. Roger Hallam, a co-founder of Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, puts it this way. Campaigners often believe they know the magnitude of the problem we face. However, knowing is not a binary concept when it comes to grief-inducing catastrophic information. You think you know it, but then you realize you haven't processed it emotionally. You think you have processed it emotionally, but then you realize you haven't done it sufficiently. This leads to a form of unconscious denial, which in turn leads to a form of personal protectionism. So he's talking about how our actions don't match the situation. At the very least, we need the political will to pass these common sense measures. And Hallam is trying to make the case for civil disobedience. Let's not let oil companies profit off our complacency. Well, the fossil fuel industry is the main villain of climate change. The meat industry is incredibly similar. Not only does the meat industry cause climate change as well, they also use the same tactics as the fossil fuel industry to greenwash us. So consider their claims of sustainable beef. This is orders of magnitude more carbon intensive than other foods. Animal agriculture is also driving the destruction of the Amazon rainforest. The dairy industry is extremely water intensive. And in addition to greenwashing, they're also humane washing us. So either way, they're selling us reduced guilt. This is effective insofar as the consumer actively avoids looking any further. But that's an appeal to emotions, not reason. So George Marshall, author of my favorite climate book, Don't Even Think About It, he talks about coming to terms with his own cognitive dissonance over his food choices. So check out this clip.
Animal rights activist comes up to me waving the report, I think it was the FAO report, that says that the impacts of a Western meat-eating diet is the equivalent per person of driving a small truck. And what do I say? Well, it's a bit hard for me to say anything because my mouth is full having taken a bite out of the biggest burger you have ever seen. And you better believe this is America, right? So this burger is about the size of half a cow. And what do I say? I go, ooh. I said, I was hungry. But I find my composure. I quickly find some clever arguments. Yes, I say, well, I cycle to work. I have a low-energy eco-home. And I say, well, surely in an eco-world we could have a little eco-burger every now and then. Surely there's a room for a few little weaknesses, but I'm doing all of this great work. You see, that's what we all do, is we find the stories to back up the disconnection between what we know and what we do. Here I want to spend my time talking to people who are not like me, who have different values. And when I meet these enemies, it's not so clear to me that they're enemies. It seems to me more clear that they're people who cannot make the connection between what they know and what they believe and what they do. I have been brought and confronted with the fact that my eating habits are simply not sustainable. Unfortunately, I love, what do you say in Brussels, steak au point? I love this. I'm going to have to change it. That is going to have to change because I have a disconnection in myself between what I know, what I think about, and what I do. And when I think about making that change, in some ways I feel sad about maybe what I might lose, but I also feel strong, I feel honest, I feel I've made that connection, I feel I have integrity to myself, and I feel powerful, and I'd like you to feel that power too.
I can relate to this. I was already an ethical vegetarian, but I gave up milk and egg products for the climate back in 2015. I was kind of sad about the prospect of not being able to eat my favorite pizza from where I grew up anymore. But my emotional drive to solve climate change was strong, and I never looked back. It all worked out, though, because Geraci's now has vegan cheese options, so if you're ever in Cleveland, you've got to try this pizza. So, in addition to purely environmental reasons for abstaining from meat consumption, Jonathan Haidt also wrote about the ethical considerations of eating meat in the happiness hypothesis. During graduate school, I discovered the weakness of moral reasoning in myself. I read Practical Ethics by Peter Singer. Singer's clear and compelling arguments convinced me on the spot and since that day I've been morally opposed to all forms of factory farming. Morally opposed, but not behaviorally opposed. I love the taste of meat, and the only thing that changed in the first 6 months after reading Singer is that I thought about my hypocrisy each time I ordered a hamburger. But then, during my second year of graduate school, I began to study the emotion of disgust, and I worked with Paul Rosen, one of the foremost authorities on the psychology of eating. Rosen and I were trying to find video clips to elicit disgust in the experiments we were planning, and we met one morning with a research assistant who showed us some videos he'd found. There was a long sequence shot inside a slaughterhouse. I watched in horror as cows moving down a dripping disassembly line were bludgeoned, hooked, and sliced up. Afterwards, Rosen and I went to lunch to talk about the project. We both ordered vegetarian meals. For days afterwards, the sight of red meat made me queasy. My visceral feelings now matched the beliefs that Singer had given me. I became a vegetarian for about 3 weeks. Gradually, as the disgust faded, fish and chicken re-entered my diet. Then red meat did too. Although even now, 18 years later, I still eat less red meat and choose non-factory farmed meats when they are available. That experience taught me an important lesson. I think of myself as a fairly rational person. I found Singer's arguments persuasive. I saw the right way and approved it, but followed the wrong, until an emotion came along to provide some force. So this demonstrates my point. It's our emotions that get us to do things. We can be comfortable saying that, right? Julia Shaw, author of Evil, is comfortable saying this. Her writer knows it's not ethical, but she can accept that emotions control her actions.
Is it wrong to eat meat? Yes. I eat meat, by the way. I am a hypocrite. Research on this actually points quite often to what's called cognitive dissonance, which is when our beliefs are not in line with our behaviors. And so for me, it's all about trying to get closer at least. So each meatless meal is a win, aligning more and more with my belief that actually eating meat is wrong. And I think actually for lots of ethical decisions, that's a good point to learn from. Each and every single choice we make, we can move closer and closer to our own ethical compass and try to align how we behave and how we believe.
So the thing that I really like about her take is that she's trying to bring her actions into alignment with her values. Many animal rights activists spend a lot of time at animal sanctuaries or doing undercover investigations or somehow continually exposing themselves to the type of horrors that Haidt was describing. This keeps their emotional responses and actions aligned with their ethics. The rider knows what it has to do to affect the elephant. Rather than being completely at the mercy of our emotions, we can help guide our emotions. Here are a few ways. So the first way I'll call visual exposure. So you can watch documentaries like Earthlings or Dominion. These films are emotionally powerful and often the turning point for people reconsidering their food choices. Another one I want to bring up is cowspiracy, but I also want to give a word of caution about this because the ethical vegan and climate scientist Michael Mann accuses this film of drastically overstating how much beef is responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. So he says in his book, The New Climate War, that cowspiracy claims that beef is the main contributor to climate change, when in actuality it's about 6% of global emissions. So for perspective, all of animal agriculture is about 16.5%. So Mann is concerned that this type of misinformation will serve to deflect the blame off the fossil fuel industry, kind of like the concept of our carbon footprint, which deflects the blame off corporations and onto us. So going vegan on its own won't solve climate change, but we can't solve climate change without addressing animal agriculture either. All right, the next way could be what I'll call experiential connection. So you can spend time with animals at a sanctuary. You can volunteer with organizations that advocate for animals or climate action. Emotional bonds are sort of made this way as well. The third way I'll suggest is what we'll call narrative and testimony. So you can read books, you can listen to stories from people who have gone through this journey. The moral psychologists like Julia Shaw and Jonathan Haidt admit to struggling with their own dissonance. That's a very deeply relatable thing. And these experiences aren't about forcing change. They're about creating space for your emotions to catch up with your values. But not everybody wants to make these changes, though, and there's a variety of reasons for that. Some people could be like Sean Hannity is on the climate. They could have be so invested in a meat-centric identity that change would cause huge social upheaval for them. There would be a brutal psychological transition. Maybe someone else is just afraid of the social implications. Maybe someone else lacks the emotional energy because they're so consumed by some other cause that they have nothing left to give. Yeah, and this last reason seems to be the reason that Stanley Cohen, author of States of Denial, isn't able to form the emotional connection to animal rights. So check out this passage. The concept of compassion fatigue may be a little shaky, but each new moral demand makes coping harder. Yet another filter or priority to be set up. I have tested this by looking at my own reactions to environmental and animal rights issues. I cannot find strong rational arguments against either set of claims, but emotionally, they leave me utterly unmoved. I am particularly oblivious, in total denial about animal issues. I know that the treatment of animals in cruel experiments and factory farming is difficult to defend. I can even see the case for becoming a vegetarian, but in the end, much like people throwing away an amnesty leaflet, my filters go into automatic drive. This is not my responsibility. There are worse problems. There are plenty of other people looking after this. What do you mean I'm in denial every time I eat a hamburger? So I find this pretty interesting. Let's consider why human rights advocates like Stanley Cohen sometimes look away. He admits it has nothing to do with the arguments. He can't find a flaw in those. But he's so consumed by human rights, and he hasn't made a meaningful connection between animal rights and human rights. So we can form new emotional connections between issues, and existing emotional connections could also diminish too. So I started worrying about climate change in 2012. I thought, once I see it, I can't unsee it. I'm going to be worried about this forever. But then in 2020, COVID-19 came along, and it was a more immediate threat to me. So for the first time in 8 years, I temporarily stopped worrying about climate change. I also made an emotional connection between climate change and animal rights in 2023 when I started watching animal rights influencers, and they were using all the same language that I heard in the climate movement. I've since learned about the standard practices of the dairy and egg industries, and now I have different reasons not to eat milk or egg products. Actually, I'd heard some of this before, but I suppressed that information. In retrospect, I wish I hadn't suppressed it, but it turns out that denial is actually very common, and I'm able to recognize it in myself after the fact. I paid attention to my emotional transition towards caring about animal rights as it was happening. Before, so for instance, I'd be in the grocery store and I'd see the meat aisle. The thought of putting any of that in my mouth would just kind of gross me out. But now the same stimuli evoke much stronger visceral reactions. The animal rights issue is now using some of my emotional bandwidth, but I try my best to generalize it so that I can continue to deeply care about climate change too. There are also meaningful connections between human rights and animal rights. The Holocaust survivor Alex Hershaft made the connection to his former situation. He argues that who the victims are is besides the point.
When I first saw the slaughterhouse, I saw all those body parts and it just brought back memories. Sure, a lot of similarities between the way the Nazis were killing our people and the way that we kill animals. Right, so we're not comparing victims here. Obviously, because I'm a Jew, I'm much more sensitive to persecution of Jews. Because I'm a human, I'm more sensitive to oppression of human beings. But because I'm also concerned with the moral universe, I'm also very concerned with the oppression of all living beings, including sentient animals.
Well, Cohen passed away in 2013, so we'll never know if he would have eventually made any of the connections between human rights and animal rights. But back when he wrote States of Denial in 2001, it was pretty common for human rights advocates to ignore climate change too. Look at how he almost has contempt for environmentalists. The success of the environmental movement has been striking. Its initial rise till the end of the 80s was partly achieved at the expense of humanitarian causes. Its message is safer, virtually non-political, and easily appeals to self-interest. If not your health, then your children's. Even if the agenda is long-term and complicated, tangible successes can be shown. Air pollution lowered, a nature zone preserved, dolphins rescued. The media, especially television, can make connections between global problems such as pollution, acid rain, greenhouse warming, disposal of toxic waste, wildlife preservation in rainforests, and the way we live our life in northern industrialized north. Think globally, act locally is a vivid media message. Such immediacy and implied causality are far more difficult to establish in the human rights arena. There are no images equivalent to the visual connection between recycling your garbage and protecting world resources. I actually think he'd be pretty surprised to find out how much has changed right now. The human rights movement has now acknowledged that climate change is one of the biggest drivers of human rights abuses. Again, we can't know if Cohen would have adapted, but since so many other human rights advocates have, I think it's reasonable to assume that he would have too. So George Marshall also makes this connection. He points out the former lack of attention to climate change in the human rights movement to illustrate disattention.
Human rights is very interesting. Climate change is, in my view, without doubt, the largest human rights and social justice issue of all time. We could imagine if, for example, the first people to the ball had been Amnesty International, the entire language and storylines of climate change would be framed in terms of their concerns, or indeed, say, unions, or indeed any group. Here's a set of typical organizations. I just did a very simple thing. I just said, how many times on their website did they mention the phrase climate change? And there was the result. Amnesty International at that time did not mention the world's greatest threat to human rights one time on their website. In order to kind of prove this doubly, I did a word check on something which had no reason whatsoever for being on their website. And that was the phrase ice cream. Ice cream is not a major concern for Refugees International, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and so on. And this was how many times the phrase ice cream appeared on their website.
So there seems to be some form of disattention towards animal rights within the climate movement and the human rights movement today. Animal agriculture is a large contributor to climate change, but it doesn't get the same attention as something like the transportation sector. Too few people have made these emotional connections between the movement they care about with the animal rights movement, even though this doesn't appear to be the case the other way around. Many vegans seem to care about all three. Just take Greta Thunberg, for example. The problem seems to be that vegans are only about 3% of the population. So if you compute the conditional probabilities for crossover, naturally these aren't going to be the same. But if more people can make these connections, then intersectionally we can combine these movements. But if I'm going to talk about intersectionality, I might as well bring up this. So Jonathan Haidt has a video warning about intersectionality.
Are said to be interlocking and overlapping. America is one giant matrix of oppression, and its victims cannot fight their battles separately. They must all come together to fight their common enemy. They must all come together to fight the straight, white, cisgendered, able-bodied Christian or Jewish or possibly atheist male. And this is why perceived slights against one victim group call forth protest from all victim groups. Intersectionality is like NATO for social justice activists.
So I hope I'm not taking this out of context, but I think his warning is more about divisiveness than anything else. I'm not trying to make this about common enemy identity politics. I really want this to be about all of us, not just the political left coming together. So I hope I'm not misinterpreting his message. So another thing that makes talking about these issues hard is that there's a socially constructed silence around each of them. It's really a strange feeling when it feels like it's you against society. I think of another one of Jonathan Haidt's books, All Minus One. This is a book that's an illustrated adaptation of Chapter 2 of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. But society needs dissenters to move forward. So supporting any of these causes is an act of defiance. Remember, changing the environment is a lot easier than changing people. So with problems this enormous, we have to attack it from all angles. I'm convinced that we need systemic changes, though. A revenue-neutral carbon tax is effective, and it's not even unpopular, but it's just not talked about enough. Plant-based meats can taste just as good or sometimes even be indistinguishable from animal meat. Cell-cultured meat is going to be widely available before we know it. We have soy milk, oat milk, cashew milk, almond milk, just egg, so on. But there's a lot of industry propaganda and misconceptions. So revenue-neutral taxes shouldn't be conflated with ordinary taxes. Oil companies tend to give this plan lip service, but they also, at the same time, lobby politicians against it. Reducing money in politics is going to get us better human rights outcomes. And mock meat's being framed as processed so that we think it's bad for us. But relative to animal meat, this isn't true. And some states are even preemptively banning cell-cultured meat, taking away our freedom to choose what we purchase. So take what I said for what you will. This is all part of the human struggle. If you don't feel any emotions towards climate change, human rights, or animal rights, remember, there are people that are experts in subjects like denial, moral psychology, climate communications, and criminal psychology. They're all aware that eating meat isn't ethical, but continue to do so anyway. There are human rights advocates that don't care about animal rights or the environment. There are animal rights advocates that don't care about human rights. There are climate change advocates that don't care about animal rights. This is normal. This is not judgment. This is an invitation. You already have the ethics. If you want to feel them more deeply, you can. And if you do, your actions will follow.